So getting started. Hi, everyone. My name is Chisom. I am the founder of Diversify, the organization behind the Blaze inclusion panel discussions. Really happy to be here. I'm an economist and also a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging strategist and enthusiast. I am located in Norway, but I am Nigerian and also Norwegian as of last year. So happy to be here. Today I am wearing a yellow, I call this a turtleneck type sweater. I have braids with some white and blonde highlights in my hair. And behind me is a plain off-white wall, so nothing interesting there. I'm a Black woman, a roundish face. So yeah, happy to be here. Mamta, you want to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chisom, and the Diversify team for inviting me to be a part of this panel. My name is Mamta Palat. I am wearing a red blazer with golden motifs on it, with a black top inside with a V-neck. My hair is about just below shoulder length, and I've got a similar to Chisom, an off-white or a white wall behind me. And I will be drinking tea time and time again from a cup which has motifs from Sri Lanka. So it's one of my favorite cups. I'm originally from India, from the south of India, but I've been in Gothenburg in Sweden for the last 5 years. And I work on the topics of inclusion and belonging at a company called Volvo Cars, specifically in the areas of talent acquisition. So today during the panel, I will be talking about it from my experience, anecdotal experiences from people I've met in the last 5 years and in Sweden. So that is what I will bring to the table today.
Thanks, Mamta. Nicole?
Good morning from Iceland. My name is Nicole. I'm the current director at the Multicultural Information Center here in Iceland. I'm wearing a patterned shirt, buttoned to the neck, a really ugly headset. I have short hair, a big smile, and behind me you'll see a blurred wall with 3 amazing feminist immigrant prints. Prints of women who've done a lot in the field of integration and inclusion and said amazing things. So I'm looking forward to the morning. And here in Iceland, we were talking about the weather earlier. It's threatening to snow and storm all day.
Thanks, Nicole. Carolina?
Hello, everybody, and I hope you can hear me fine, Chisom. And yeah, super great. So my name is Carolina. I'm delighted to be here. I dare to say this is the first panel where I join as one of the speakers. I'm Brazilian. I was born in Brazil, but I've been living in Denmark for 14 years. And I currently work as a customer success executive, part of Red Hat. But on top of my day-to-day job as a customer success executive, I'm also the co-chairwoman of the Red Hat Women Leadership Community. And I should say this is the door that opening up my whole interest and passion about why we should be talking about this agenda, which goes way beyond women. But for me, that was the way I started to learn about, because I joined the community a few years back. I'm here to learn and share. I'm open to a lot of insights, but I'm also willing to share some of my experience throughout this past years. I'm in my office/guest room. As a Brazilian who lives in Denmark, I need to make sure I have space for guests when they come over to visit me. There is a wall, like very white wall in the background, but there's a bed, so that is more like a sofa bed, grayish, and I'm wearing a pink sweater because it's been quite cold today, so I could not, go away from my very cozy sweater for work day. So, that's about me, and I look forward to start the discussions.
Thanks, Carolina. And Laura?
Well, hey there, everybody. I'm Laura Smith. I am a brown-skinned Black American who's been living in Europe for about the past 12 years or so, and had some stints living in Brazil and Spain and other places before that. But I am here talking with you with a wide red lip smile, and I'm wearing a gray flat cap over some barely visible very short natural hair. Let's see, I'm wearing a black turtleneck and a gray jumpsuit while sitting in front of a gray curtain. I am the new DEI lead at Waltz, the food delivery company, and I'm also the founder of Validate, a research agency that focuses on DEI and organizational responsibility audits. And I am very much looking forward to sharing data-informed insights with you from my research experience in the Nordics here.
Amazing. Thank you all. And thank you all online or on LinkedIn and here in Zoom with us. I'm going to jump right in. Or before I jump right in, we were supposed to have another panelist today, Jane from Holland. But unfortunately, she's not able to join us, but we hope to bring her back in one of the upcoming sessions. All right, so jumping right in. The topic for today is centering equity in Nordic diversity and inclusion ambition. So why have we chosen this topic to start with? I think we've chosen this topic because it's the topic of equity is often misused as a synonym for equality. And especially within the Nordic context, oftentimes when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we quickly, fall on gender equality. And even when we look at gender equality, we don't have necessarily an equity lens when we address this topic, and equity is very important. So I think just to define very quickly what equity is versus equality. Equality would be, I'm simplifying this, but basically giving everyone the same thing, which in theory sounds really good. In practice, it's not always good. And equity is recognizing that people need different resources to arrive at the same point. So in order to actually reach equality, we have to use an equity lens. So without equity, we cannot actually attain the equality that we also very much seek in society. And also from a Nordic perspective, oftentimes when we talk about the need for equity, oftentimes conversations become a little bit uncomfortable because we're shaking trees that we don't necessarily always want to shake. And it's nice to have cozy conversations around equality and opportunity and treat everyone as though we're the same, given that the Nordics are very egalitarian, and there's something quite amazing about that. But we also have to recognize that, if we're able to solve challenges in the workplace or in society, we have to identify constraints that different individuals face in order to create solutions that meet their need. So with that in mind, I'm jumping straight into my questions, and I will begin actually with Carolina. So Carolina, I know you've worked in tech. And in the past, 1 to 2 years, there's a lot of conversation around attracting more women in the tech sector. So can you share with us a little bit about your experience as a woman when it comes to equity or equality within the tech sector? And what challenges do you find between genders? And I guess when I'm also talking about gender, also just including and moving beyond the binary, who's a man and who's a woman, but all genders. What are some of the challenges?
Absolutely. And Chisom, I will start by also even going back a little bit when you started the beginning. You said, for example, we talk about it in the Nordics, and my first reaction is also to think that, yes, we talk about the topic in the Nordics, but we don't talk enough. Especially my honest opinion is that we tend to do in the safe environments where people openly want to hear about it. But as soon as you go outside a little bit of, what I often call the bubble of people that are willing to discuss the topic, you tend to face, a big wall of being willing to discuss about it. So to answer your question, when it comes to equity and equality within the tech sector, I do have a strong belief that we are behind. It is very common that you enter a tech environment and most of the people are the white male people that have access for many years throughout it. So what I like to often reflect on is that I was brought into this agenda because of the women leadership community. So based on that perspective, my first view was, as you said, on the very, gender aspect, women versus men. And it is true that when you come into those environments, you right away feel the reaction that you are one within so many when it comes to women and men. But as soon as you start looking into the equity agenda and you understand the need behind it, that's also when you detach yourself and see, well, the problem is it goes way beyond. So after 14 years living in Denmark, I dare to say that most locals, and when I say locals, I say Danes and residents, because I'm based in Copenhagen and it's very international. We do believe in myself when I first came here, that the tools are there and that society offers what is needed in order for you to make your choices. So there is a strong belief that now we are all ready and mature enough to make the choices that we want. But what we tend to forget is that historically speaking, there is a big gap between opportunities that we're giving for those to reach the goal of becoming, a tech professional, etc. And that gap shows us that there is a big privilege within the hands of a minority, which is the white males, if you take the gender aspect. And one could argue that bringing this topic to life, it's there. People are talking about it, but are we talking enough? Are we talking across entire teams on your day-to-day perspective? And my answer would say, no, we are not. And if I use my own experience in a techie company, as soon as we bring this kind of discussions outside of those that join the agenda, voluntarily, quite often you hear, everything is okay, what are you talking about? We don't have a problem, but we do. So my conclusion after, being in this agenda and trying to understand and learn myself is that we need to be ready to answer difficult questions. Why is this important? It's not easy. It's quite often not easy to answer those questions when people come to us and say, for example, I heard in my career, women should be doing what they're good at, which is communication and marketing. And you need to be able to have tools to say, listen to what you're saying, look around yourself. I often also say how important is the power of sharing stories. Once you make, you promote the visualization of the problem, people tend to relate more to it and realize, okay, now I get it. And just to sum up my thought, I have to say, and I'm always very proud when I say that, joining the agenda was a turning point in my career. Understand the importance of agenda really gave me tools to grow as a woman, create my confidence, and understand that I can also be this ally to bring the agenda forward. So it's not easy, it's a journey, but we need to continue talking about it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. I think it's really important, like engaging with others on, topics that we care about, because they also bring their different, experiences and their perspectives. And I think that's how we learn, because even sometimes when we are very passionate about something, we often tend to see it from our lens. So unless we start to engage with others who have different experiences, sometimes we don't really get to learn. And I think that's one of the things you're highlighting, just in terms of like joining this agenda was an eye-opening, process for you. So thanks for that. I'm going to move to Memtha. When we had the prep call for this panel, you mentioned, I think, a challenge most people in the Nordics who work within, say, recruitment, or who, I guess, emigrate at some point understand, which is basically the challenges that a lot of internationals face. And this, you were talking about it from the framework of Sweden, because this is where you live. And also you talked about the fact that some of these challenges are often not centered in the public workplace, and especially when we're talking about integration. Nonetheless, you also talked about having very positive experience with companies you've worked at and how those companies were very intentional in bridging the gap. So my question for you is, how important is policy on a societal and workplace level to ensure that inclusion and representation of diverse talents succeed in the Swedish workplace? And second, can you share some practical tips on how companies, are going to, basically, what are they doing to bridge the gap?
Absolutely. I think I also want to reflect on what Carolina's statement about, if you're a woman, you should be in marketing or communications. I think my first shock of moving to Sweden in 2018, when I started my interview process and started talking to people, and the reason I bring this is also about the equity and the equality lens and the perception that I have, or a lot of people have about the Nordics, that it's a very equal, gender equal society. And here I'm talking about the binary male and female gender equal society. Moved in, in India, 5 years, worked in a big nonprofit, senior position, set up the organization across the country, was great. And I came in thinking, oh, it's going to be fine. But then I came here, had a couple of interviews, and there was this one interviewer who reached out to me in the face-to-face interview and said, "You're a young woman and you just got married and moved. You might become a young mother soon, ... And I know at that point I decided I will never work for that company, and it is a very big company. So, and I said, this is also coming from a place of privilege, but I said, no, I will not work for that company. I will take up something else, but I don't want to work for a company where the interviewer, the hiring manager is very obviously non-inclusive, right? But I think that's also one of the reasons why I am so invested in this topic of inclusion and belonging, because of my personal experience of understanding that the Nordics is equal in the sense of the world it is, but there is also a very biased labor market, right? There is a biased labor market towards multiple minority groups, but this I want to talk about in the context of international people who have moved to Sweden for multiple reasons, right? Because they've been forced to move, because they've moved voluntarily, because they've moved for studies. And if you're in the tech space or if you're in the automotive space, it's much easier for you to get a job. But if you're in the non-tech or non-automotive space, it's much harder for you, right? And yes, it is tough, but the Swedish government is also doing multiple things to bridge that gap from an equity lens as well. So they are organizing activities in order to help international people, write your CV in a Swedish context, run interviews in a Swedish context, also helping them network, right? So also understanding that people who move don't understand what is the labor market, how does that work? And the Swedish government, it's the Swedish Labor Office or Unemployment Office helps with that. But more so, there are a lot of private players in the market as well that does this, right? So there are organizations that work primarily with mentorships. I don't know if y'all have heard of this organization called Mittliv or Opetus in Sweden. Then when it comes to internships, there are very, very big ones here called Jobbsprånget for international people. There are ones called Tekniksprånget that work with young adults that want to go in. But all of this works in conjunctions with employers. So they are private players, but they need to partner with companies in order to reduce the unemployment statistics or to ensure that people are employed. Right? So when you talk about policy, there is some policy needs to be made in the company that's saying we are taking a decision to ensure that we want more people in. And how are we going to do that, right? And it's a biased labor market. Yes, people should be entering in irrespective. They shouldn't be coming in through an internship, right? But that's the reality of it. And then companies are trying to bridge that gap, right? And apart from that, also there are organizations like the International House of Gothenburg or Move to Gothenburg that primarily they work with employers. And right now, I was going on their website, which they are working with employers to make them understand how do they need to cater their process to international talents as well. And then analysis of job ads to ensure that it's inclusive. That is so important, right? You're writing your job ads in a particular manner that caters to the binary or the normative group. But how can that be catered to be a lot more inclusive for different underrepresented groups globally, or if your operations are in Sweden as well, right? So analysis of that, and then your talent attraction plan. How is your talent attraction plan? Are you just posting on LinkedIn, or are you posting in other places? So for example, Workspaces in Norway and Diversify in Norway has now blown up, and it is the hub for international talents. Our company is reaching out to you, say, hey, do you have a place where we can post our job ads? Can you advertise our job ads? So how are employers also understanding what the market is saying? So policy does play a huge role, but I would also say having key stakeholders in these who have the power to make decisions is also an integral part when it comes to inclusion of underrepresented groups in the Nordics.
Thanks a lot for sharing. I think there's a lot of information in there. And I think, especially from, the Swedish context, but what that resonates for me is kind of just like a chessboard. I don't play chess, so maybe this is a bad analogy, but in my mind, I'm thinking you kind of just like all the pieces have to like fit together. From a stakeholder analysis perspective, we need to engage, the social sector, the workplace sector, and also the individual, and how do we, unlock all the resources therein to amplify the chances of inclusion of, say, immigrants and internationals who've moved to a place. Maybe that chess thing did not work, but hopefully it did. All right, so I'm going to move next to Laura. So Laura, in the Nordics, as I said earlier, gender equality and gender representation are often centered when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And I think like a lot of Nordic countries, relatively in comparison to the rest of the world, they do it quite well from a binary and homogeneous perspective. But we know there's a lot of room for improvement. So my question to you is, in thinking about gender equality beyond intersectional representation, why is it important to also account for things like access, power, and influence?
Honestly, a thing that I noticed when we're talking about, intersectional, representation, we talk about representation in general, especially equitable representation, we're not oftentimes taking into account that that is actually an outcome. Okay. So when you're talking about, trying to get in different kinds of people from different, lifestyles, different kind of demographics, you have to think it's not just a matter of like a talent attraction exercise. It's not just a matter of, a branding exercise. It's not a matter of just getting people in there. What you want to make certain is that you're building in the other types of equity that you need to be able to get that equitable outcome of representation, okay? So you have to think about the different types of equity that are out there, right? So they're mainly, I like to focus on 7 different things. As a researcher, I kind of would look at different things. So I look at equitable invitation. That's what people think about, when they oftentimes think about, hey, let's try to get more diverse representation. And that would be things like the sourcing, advertising, your employer brand. How's that going, right? But then you've also got equitable evaluation. So in the application process and for the people that you've hired, so if you're looking at how can you get intersectional, improvements in terms of you want not just, white women, but you're trying to get people who are, different genders. You're trying to also get people of different abilities, different religions, different, nationalities. Well, then you have to make sure you're thinking about, evaluation, think about access, you think about, accessibility and location of how your employee experience is going to be. You have to think about support. You have to make certain that you cater how you care for people. That's an important thing. Equitable opportunity. So you have to look at knowledge and information flow, your approval process. Power is absolutely important. You have to think about the voice. You have to think about influence, position. How is that in the organization? Because that absolutely impacts growth and retention. So if you get people in there as decorative diversity, they're not going to grow, they're not going to thrive, and they're not going to stay. So these are absolutely important things. And of course, equitable compensation to make sure that, people are fairly rewarded for their contributions to the organization, to the business. So yes, equitable representation and intersectional representation, for different groups of people, absolutely things that you want to look at and you want to measure and want to aim for. But realistically, that is the outcome that comes from equitable practices, policies, and protocol. It comes from actually equitable application of a good business culture and a good organizational culture with intentionality towards different groups.
Thanks a lot for that, Laura. I often think about, how since diversity and inclusion blew up in the past couple of years, a lot of companies talk about psychological safety and mental health and well-being and showing up as you are. And I'm just like, oftentimes I think in theory, that sounds really good, but they really don't want to do the work that it takes to actually get, to get people to a point where they feel psychologically safe, where they feel seen, where they feel like they can show up as they are. And I think equity has a lot to do with this. A lot of what you've listed out today is necessary in just terms of like, okay, let's look at this aspect, let's look at that aspect. How are we doing the work? Because we can say come as you are as much as we want to say it, but if we're not actually doing the work to support it, nothing is going to change. Nothing is going to happen.
Can I come back with that one quick thing about?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's no such thing as, psychological safety if you don't have personal professional safety. Okay.
Absolutely.
So you can't say like, hey, yeah, you can come as you are, you can say what you want, but people are going to get fired for that. And you're not going to get promoted for this and these kind of things. There's no such thing. There's no context for psychological safety, right? So that doesn't work in that way. I mean, you have to think about building up those prerequisites of safety, of real safety, in the sense of like, what's the actual framework that these people are existing in, before you start trying to say, hey, come as you are. And yet, you haven't thought about equitable access. People can't literally go into the building, and such, for people who use wheelchairs can't enter, literally can't come as they are. So you really have to think about real, not just fuzzy in the air words and phrases. Think about on the ground application for these things.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot. Nicole, I'm going to come to you. When we spoke, you talked about many challenges that exist in Iceland when it comes to policies directed towards like immigrants, internationals, expats, foreigners, especially from a workplace framework. So I think you said something about Iceland being stuck on equality, but not taking into account the different needs that people have. And that's what we're talking about here, which is equity. So my question to you is it, I see that we see similar things across different parts of the Nordics and even in workplaces. So my question is it ignorance or resistance to change or resistance to inclusion? And the second part would be, what can be done to center equity in Icelandic policies and initiatives?
The big one. And as per usual, I had a really nice written answer, but then I listened to the dialogue with the other wonderful women who are here today, and I'm like, oh, I want to say so much more. But no, I don't want to say it's, I don't want to, yes, there is ignorance, but I think what the ignorance is based on is that gray matter. The gray matter between what's really happening and what people think is happening, where people are today and where they want to be. And the less that we step into that gray area, that gap, mind the gap in England, something happens there, instead of using that gap to create the magic that needs to happen for integration and equity. We speak about equity, about meeting the needs. It's also about allowing in a society where values like equality and human rights are held at a very high level, as they are in Iceland, that we see equity as an inalienable right for people to determine themselves. How far do I want to go in the job market? What do I want to do? Then equity, it's when it's translated in Icelandic, there is no actual word, but it comes up as eigið fé, my money, my value. So when I think about it in sort of literal terms, I think that those are the things that we need to speak about. And what's sort of happening in Iceland is that there are some things that are fear-based. not fear in the sense of populism, but people can completely sway, you know, that battering ram. You know, be afraid of the others, be afraid of what they could do, but it's more in connection to maybe a loss, you know, a fear of losing or you know, some of those conservative values that go back to being an Icelandic Viking, even though I don't actually see people living here like Icelandic Vikings, you know, those sort of cultural things, they're concerned. In Iceland, it's very, you know, language has a huge, language works in two ways. One, it's a gift to those of us who move here. It's important that we have access to it, that we're mentored in it, that we're given room to create our own equity with the language and move forward and up and around whoever we want. But we're also held down when we don't have enough of it or we don't do it right. I'm sure that I'm not saying anything that anyone in a Nordic country isn't saying, that the better your Icelandic skills are here, the further you'll go in the job market, in society, in acceptance. But there are lots of, you know, access to language courses. It's not equal. It's not you know, put forth in a manner where people who move here who perhaps don't have reading and writing skills in their own language are created a stronger, bigger platform to get to where they need to get, so that this Icelandic language becomes a part of our heritage now who live here and our culture and moving forward together. Also, something I'd like to talk about in this gap. I've been working a lot with reception and all the things we can do in reception, whether it's reception in society of a person of a diverse background. And when I say diverse background, I don't just mean immigrants, I mean any diverse background, how we receive them, what information we give that supports them in being an active participant and wanting to be an active participant and understanding this new environment. And in the labor market, it's even more crucial. I've been working with the Chamber of Commerce here and creating sort of a diagram for a policy where we have onboarding, you know, goal-oriented onboarding solutions where we go all the way down into little things like incorporating information about the community where the business is located. So these are things that we need to think about. Equity is, yeah, it's not ignorance. It's just not giving ourselves time to look into those deeper meanings and the value and the equity we create on the other side. It's not just the efforts we make. I don't know, I talked in it really, but and another thing just to go really quickly into is economic growth. It cannot be the determining factor of equity. Because here in Iceland, we are an economic monster. Just say we just generate jobs and jobs and jobs, and the job market is calling for 9,000 people. 9,000 people is a significant population number in Iceland. You must understand this. And when it's looked at in this member, no one's looking at the fact that on the MyPEX index, we only score 33 of 100 points when it comes to upward mobility on the job market. And I think that I'm just going to leave those words there. Upward mobility and the call for economic diversity, equity, all of that stuff together, they need to work and move forward.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Nicole. Mamta, did you want to say something?
I think I was just reflecting on what Nicole was talking about the language. I think the perception that a lot of international people have is that as compared to the other countries, the mobility towards Iceland is much better from a language perspective, because the perception is you don't need to know the local language in Iceland, even for upward mobility. So it's quite a new learning for me, I would say.
It's not true at all. I'm the only person of foreign origin who heads a government agency. And if the public sector isn't leading in presence of mind when it comes to equity and inclusion, then we know it's not happening in other sectors.
But congratulations to you.
Well, my job ends in a couple of weeks, so short-lived.
I think what I was just reflecting on is, you know, the paradox of the Nordics, where on paper it's glorious, and then in practice, it doesn't always feel that way. I mean, there are always exceptions, of course, And I know that, a lot of us, here in some capacity are quite privileged, and we've navigated the systems and the structures, but recognizing that for a lot of other people. And I mean, the way my sister talks about Norway from the US, it's this like wonderful land where everyone flies on unicorns. And sometimes I have to break her heart, and just be like, yo, I mean, we're not as bad, but, so I think it's really interesting to merge the two, how countries are seen versus how they work, in practice. I'm going to move on to Carolina. And I want to come back to this topic about centering equality and the need to bring in equity. So we've talked about the fact that in the Nordics, when we talk about gender equality, everyone's really happy to engage. But the minute we start talking about equity, it becomes really uncomfortable for a lot of conversations. Like case in point, we're still in March, right? So March, Women's Month. And we all want to go out and say, yay, women, more opportunities and, more gender equality for women. But then when we start bringing in perspectives of like racialized women or trans women or this or that, then the conversations quickly get uncomfortable. So my question for you, Carolina, is, I mean, one, why is this seen as a null-sum game, where like we can't talk about gender equality and talk about like inclusion of gender diverse people, or talk about the challenges and constraints that say Black, brown women face, for example. And what can we do to actually bridge this understanding gap, that we can have multiple conversations simultaneously and still advocate for that same gender equality, but from an equity lens?
I want to start by saying that it's very hard to be part of a panel and be quiet. I want to interrupt all the time and bring all the ideas that are going across my mind. I think this is the beauty of dialogue, of having, brilliant people to talk about different aspects and perspective. The language, for example, I could spend hours talking about the language aspect. But going back to your question, Chisan, I would say the first thing that crosses my mind when I think about your question is how important it is for us to understand something that was mentioned quite often in this call, the privilege aspect, but on top of it, having empathy. Once we understand the power of what it is a privilege and those that hold it, and the aspect of empathy, putting yourself in the shoes of others, we soon start to navigate across the gender discourse. And in my view, of course, yes, it should coexist. But what we lack sometimes is for people to understand the privilege they come from and having empathy towards others. So, for instance, I again entered the D&I agenda via the women lens, right? I entered tech as a woman. I joined the women leadership community. And I initially understood that I got tools and information on how the tech industry is disregarding women. There are tons of books out there. I could hear my peers in the industry saying, this is not okay. We are way behind. And also as a user, right, of the actual technology. But I also started to understand that beyond this agenda, there is much more. I am a white woman. I have a European passport in my hands because my dad, Harry, I got an Italian citizenship through him. I started building this career tech, but I do hold a lot of privilege myself. And how is it to be a woman of color in Denmark, which if you look around, the majority is in my office, for example, they are actually white people. How is it if you don't have a citizenship and you have to go through an entire different aspect in order to be able to work and act locally? It's a different perspective. It's a different place, and having empathy of putting yourself in the shoes of others will also help you, for instance, overcome the challenge of the language. Not everybody has the same, skills of learning a language. It might take one thing for me and one thing for the other person. So understanding the privilege and having empathy will allow you to have a dialogue. And I'm trying to come to the answer of your question. Well, at least, my perspective of how I would answer your question here, but dialogue is essential. If people do not even understand the quality, imagine how can you enter the whole picture and discussion of what equity means? we need to have an open dialogue. We need to be able to bring our ideas forwards and hear, what is it that the perspective comes from the other end. Another thing that I thought about it is, again, I just mentioned before the power of stories, sharing your experience throughout your agenda and how you bring those topics along will make people realize that although DNI and etc. and the gender effect is something that we talk, there is still a whole, there's still a lot more as part of it to be understood, to be in the picture. And just to conclude, because as I said, it's difficult to hold back and you just want to talk a lot when you're part of those panels. We mentioned policies, companies should have policies around it, etc. But the truth is, by the end of the day, we're people. What are policies unless people don't show this empathy and understand their privilege towards what can I do to make a difference? In tech, we often say, what is technology unless you have people and process aligned? What is a DNI agenda if you don't have people aligned? So dialogue, I'll go back to the dialogue aspect. We need to continue having this open dialogue. Just to conclude, I could continue my job without bringing the DNI agenda. As I said, I'm a white woman. I have a lot of privilege. I work in the tech industry. I have a European passport. I can do my customer success executive role, but I put this agenda on top of it because I see the importance. So having dialogue needs us to get out of our comfort zone and put ourselves into a situation to learn from others and having empathy to understand that we do hold different realities. And thereby, we need to talk about it to understand the need of equity, for example.
Right. Thanks for sharing, Carolina. I think about policies, it's perhaps also important to include the design and the leadership of the people you're looking to serve in making that policy. Because I've seen a lot of really bad policies. And when you look at them, you're just like, yeah, I'm sure the target group were not even included. They didn't even ask them a single question when they came up with this thing that was supposed to save and elevate them. And I think that is often one of the challenges that a lot of these policies present. It's something else that came up for me about language is that also learning language is a privilege. When you show up in a country, as an adult, maybe if you're 5, it's, everything you gets in like that. But when you're an adult, you have to worry about your rent. You have bills, there are things you have to worry about. You don't have the luxury of sitting in a classroom for 6 hours each day for 3 days a week to learn a language, right? And oftentimes, some of the best ways to learn language is within the workforce, because then you have, that incentive to do so. So I think it's also something we should pay attention to, because oftentimes it takes anywhere from 6 months to a year or 2 for people to fully immerse themselves in a culture, say in a language. And that is time spent outside the workforce. And that is gap, more or less, is the gap in your CV that you have to explain when you go to a recruiter. So I think that also comes from a privileged perspective. And of course, I don't know how it is in other Nordic countries, but I can say in Norway, it's really expensive to even take language courses if you've not come here as a spouse of a Norwegian citizen, for example, if you've not come in as, say, a refugee or an asylum seeker. So if you've come in as somebody who needs to work or an expat or work migrants, then it's really difficult to afford the time as well as the money in the meantime when you're trying to get set up and situated in the country.
Yeah. And Chisan, if I could just add one thing, how about the empathy from the others towards you? Quite often you are asked about the language, or you're told that, things will be much easier when you integrate with the language. And that's true. But in order for someone to learn the language, those others that are in the situation of, for example, being a Dane, you need to also understand that you are part of this journey. You, dear colleague, Danish, who speak the local language, you're part of this journey of me learning a language, because I will not learn overnight. Right. So it's it goes back and forth in that sense as well. That's why it helps us when we start understanding, putting ourselves in the shoes of others, I believe.
Right. Thank you. Mamta, I'm going to come to you. Also, during our prep call, you talked about some sensitization initiatives that Sweden has to promote awareness for inclusion of, diverse people in the workplace. So my question to you is, have those translated into more job opportunities for migrants? And what are some of the challenges and opportunities within these initiatives?
Okay, absolutely. But also reflecting on what Carolina was saying about, I think it ties into the answer as well about privilege and language and what Sweden is doing as well, is that if we take the language into consideration, yes, there are free classes available for a select group of people. But like you said, if there are individuals who move for work, but still need to know the language, there are still, again, private players in the market that do this for free, right? So what they do is they try and help you build a network. So there is an organization called Compass Byrån, and I don't know if they're still functioning, but when I joined, it was more or less Compass means also try and get a friend, right? So look for a friend. So you get a friend, but you also can practice your language over here, and that is one of the free ways to do that, and you can do that after work as well. The city library, they do a lot of initiatives or Språk cafes, as you may call it, in order to help people even learn the language. And apart from that, I didn't realize this, but Facebook is very actively used in Sweden, and everything that runs in the city is on Facebook as well. So there are multiple channels that you can use on Facebook in order to understand how you want to include yourself in the society, but also how other organizations and people are creating that platform to help you feel included as well, right? But talking about sensitization initiatives, so a couple of things that I already mentioned with the Swedish Employment Agency, working on that, as well as the mentorship, internship, analyzing job ads. Is also that there are organizations that also work with representations from the government in order to sensitize them about the needs of international people and what the government structures need to do in order to change their policy to create more initiatives as well. So there is an organization called Opportunity that's really working on this quite a bit. But another one is also the company that I work at, Volvo Cars, also works with marginalized communities. And here I'm going to talk about children from the marginalized communities of different origins, right? So there are marginalized communities in Sweden wherein the children need access to good quality education and a place to show them that there is upward mobility for them when it comes to working at a Volvo Cars factory or at a Volvo Cars or a Volvo Group, for example, right? So it's something that we work with the city to do that, to ensure that these kids don't work in harmful environments, but they can come in and study, and based on the marks and how they do well, etc., they can also work, right? So these are a few things that, for example, Volvo Cars does. So not just taking into account the normative group of the international community, that is people who've moved, the privileged community that have moved looking for jobs, but also the second generation immigrants in Sweden who have children who don't need to get into any harmful activities, but can work, right? But can work in organizations like Volvo Cars as well. There is a lot more that needs to be done. There is a lot companies need to do to take into account what people need in order to thrive. So it's not just, okay, I want to survive, I want to get a paycheck. But in order for them to thrive, in order for them to feel safe in a society, there's a lot more that companies need to do. But these are just one or two things that Volvo Cars does, and a couple of the companies that I've worked with have done as well. Yeah. Any reflections on that as well?
I wonder though, so in terms of, so you talked about, and you share a lot around, what's it called? initiatives that work. And, sometimes I'm just like listening to him, like, maybe I should move to Sweden. But anyway, I've been here a bit too long. But my question though, I think you touched on it, but I would love to see, like, so based on what I know of people in Sweden who still struggle nonetheless. So how accessible are some of these programs, or limited are some of this program to all the different type? You can't fix everything for everyone, but how accessible are they to a large group of immigrants or internationals who arrive? And are these well known? You know a lot, I know, because you've engaged in this for the past 5 years. Are these like things that are well known?
Yes and no. Yes and no. So in terms of accessibility, if you are on LinkedIn, if you're on Facebook, you know everything. Because it's just people know where the international people are, and they target those activities around that. But if you do come from a certain section that's not super active on a LinkedIn, or not super active on a Facebook, I'd also know that there are specific newspapers, for example, that cater to specific groups of people. I also know organizations that market their activities on that in order to get people to come in. And the other one is everyone flocks towards the Swedish Public Employment Office, right? Every community, you are international, if you have disabilities, etc. Everyone moves. If you are unemployed, you go to the Swedish Public Employment Office. So people try and put all of the information over there as well to find out. Yes, it is extremely hard to find a job in Sweden. It might seem that I've painted a very rosy picture about Sweden. I've had my share of struggles. I know a friend of I know people who have had to wait for about 7 years to get a job. It's tough. It is a very, very tough market. It's very competitive. And right now, with a lot more international people coming in, it's getting a lot more competitive. But what I've realized that how people stand out is, it's also quite sad, but how people stand out is to showcase what they're doing to be inclusive. So there's still a lot of pressure on the international person to do the multiple activities. And one of the first feedback that I received was that we don't understand your CV because it's in Bangalore, in India, you've done amazing stuff, but we don't understand it. So I've had to then reorient my mind to then work in organizations that have the Swedish tag to get that on my CV in order for people to understand that, okay, this is what I can do as well. But so Carolina, you spoke about empathy, but there's also a lot of pressure on the international person to sensitize the other side. And I think that is what is lacking in the Nordics when it comes to equity. That the pressure on the international person to do that, but then why is it not coming from the other side?
Right. I think maybe it also has something to do with validation. You're not credible until another Norwegian company or Nordic company says you are credible, but you have to depend on that first company that gives you a chance for that credibility. And I think this is why a lot of people end up in volunteer positions or internship positions or things of this nature. Nicole, you wanted to add something?
You're not credible until we find here in Iceland, there are a lot of people who are overqualified. And in 2019, I always reference this. It was one report that was put out where it was the first time I generally experienced that we were looking at our diversity amongst immigrants and looking at the different social and societal things that immigrants were dealing with. And one of the things that came forward there was, immigrants are paying much larger percentage of their wages towards housing and had less access to the housing market. Things like this that we all probably understand. But the one thing was this Icelandic term, which us women of foreign origin spoke about again and again, was overeducated. That more than an average number of immigrants who are working in positions were either overeducated in the position they were working in, working for far lower pay scale than they should be, that their education wasn't, evaluated in it, or that there were people who had skills where there just wasn't a job that applied to their skills. A good example was an EMP woman from Poland. She explained to me what they had in there. She showed up and she wanted to work there, and it was just not transferable, but she had more experience than some of the people who were working in the field here. And again, language tied into that. So what you had said, transferable, but there's so many buts in this conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nicole. Laura? No?
Yeah, one second.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say, honestly, trust is a currency in the Nordics. Trust is absolutely a currency. And I think that's something that's a really hard thing to understand. It's a currency that you can't necessarily convert over as easily as you can, whatever type of money you have, right? So let's say, for instance, when you start looking at access to employment, yes, you're right. People do expect you to have local credibility in order to be able to validate that you have some kind of experience worth, taking into account and to trust and to rely on. I know in Finland, a very big thing people do, they often work as freelancers. People work and they'll start their own companies. And, a criteria, I think people often do, they'll get international validation. They'll get international clients. You get a big enough client externally that has a big enough name, then people will maybe, accept that you are competent. But it oftentimes takes that. You have to get somebody that they trust to vouch for you, whether it's in the company or in the country, ideally, but it's a hard thing when a lot of job offers, when a lot of opportunity gets circulated within small trust circles, and equitable access to that is not even something people are considering at this point. How do you expand that? And that's a big thing.
Right. I'm going to stay with you. Oh, Mamta, quickly.
Sorry, Chizom, but also very interesting. I don't think we touched on the aspect of networking. I think, Laura, you briefly spoke about it, but
I'll talk about that.
Yeah. Networking in the Nordics or in Sweden, again, context is very different from the networking in India. Because in India, I know that my uncle or my dad or my mom or aunt can call and say, hey, I know someone who's looking for a job. Can you create this position for them? Very common. And then when I moved here, a lot of my network in India said, oh, we know people here. Let's try and get you a meeting. They were very receptive to them, but ignored all of my emails because they don't know me. So I think it's also about trust. Trust is a currency in the Nordics, and how you network here is very different from how you network in your home countries, right? And that I think that's a key role, and a lot of people make mistakes in the beginning. I made a lot of mistakes. I just went up to people and said, hey, I'm amazing, give me a job. And it was wrong on so many levels. And then I had to okay, this is not how you network here. So yeah.
I tend to joke with a friend of mine that in Norway, at least, you need to have 500 coffees with people, like the same person, until they feel like they can trust you. So I'm mindful of time because we need to move ahead. Nicole, did you have a quick thing to add? No?
Just really quick, in Iceland, it's moving between networks. You can get stuck in a network here. And I find that a lot of us who have foreign origin, we have our network and we have our strengths, and making an outlet into another network sometimes is difficult. So it's we have a bubble network economy, or whatever you want to call it. So it was just really interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Laura, I'm gonna come to you. And I have a question for you with two parts, right? So we know that equity in the workplace has a lot to do with the opportunities, say, for example, in this case, immigrants, underrepresented and marginalized groups perceive that they have access to. So my question is, one, within the Finnish society as you know it, what opportunities or what expectations do people of the global majority have about their potential advancements in the workplace? And second, how can, I guess, we or the Finnish society develop equitable recruitment processes that allows the ascension or upward mobility of diverse talents in leadership roles and in boards.
Okay, those are big things. I'll try to keep it, as succinct as possible. Okay, one thing, the global majority, that's a term we're using here. That's oftentimes a synonym for what we'll call minoritized folks, just to make certain folks are on the same page. Keep in mind, there's a lot of diversity in that. So we talk about expectations. We have very privileged, citizens of the global majority here, right? The expats, right? We have the expat privilege group. And they have expectations that, when they come over, maybe they might be able to fit in and slot in to something that's equivalent to where they were on the social totem pole where they came from, right? And we have, other folks who are from, different kind of backgrounds, and maybe they don't have that privilege coming in there. But the reality is the expectations that people have coming in here are going to be absolutely tempered by the realities of the ecosystem, the job market here. And the expectations people have when they look at them, the expectations people have when they see them, and people are going to follow patterns. In Finland, you're going to see that people from the global majority, which would be, various people of different colors, etc. You're going to see them get slotted into things like roles of cleaners, carers, and couriers. And those are the kind of roles you're going to see people get slotted into. A lot of the social aid and a lot of social assistance will kind of push you towards those things because people follow patterns, and patterns are recursive, right? So if people have the expectation that, they look at you, they say, this is what you can do based off of more what you look in, as opposed to more than who you are and what you can do, then they're going to support you in certain ways. They're going to channel you in certain ways. And, different generations are going to grow up looking at things and thinking that this is what is the expectation for them. It limits your role models. It shapes what's supported and recommended. Okay. And that, once again, creates recursive aspirations sometimes. Okay. The thing is, there are also systemic patterns that you think about, because the system is going to reproduce that, not just personal perceptions. And that's going to be a thing to keep in mind. And the patterns are going to shape expectations. They're going to shape perceptions and actions. So even if you have a lot of talent, you're going to have to understand expectations are going to shape who's valued, who's listened to, and who advances. Okay. That's where systems shape realities. And that's why it's very, very, very important that we shape the systems that shape the expectations, that shape the outcomes. When you're talking about, I think the second part of the question was about the outcomes in terms of representation in like boards and leadership roles. Well, that's a thing, because we're talking about networks. We're talking about like trust, right? Well, in the Nordics, most board positions are network hires, right? I mean, think about it. When's the last time you looked on LinkedIn and you saw a role posted for an open board position? That's not exactly how it goes, right? Those are almost always network hires, and they are invitation only. And that's the situation. The reason for that is because trust is a barrier and xenophobia is rampant. That's a thing. And it's not, it's not just a matter of like, foreigners. It really is like who's in your network. People feel like they've grown up with people. They have folks they went to school with. They have people they have long standing histories with. And that's that currency that some people are really rich in. And that's what people tap into. The problem is, talent and opportunity shouldn't, they need to be a bit more broader distributed, right? So let's think about potential solutions for that. You have to think about alternative forms of trust building. You have to have clear ways of validating competency and relevance. You have to think about valuing and requiring new perspectives as criteria. You have to actually elevate difference as an advantage when it comes to selecting and when evaluating people for leadership positions. You have to make certain that we're valuing and requiring that stakeholders have, diverse insight. I think a big thing is oftentimes we have different kind of companies and organizations, and we're saying, hey, you have to be absolutely talented in different ways. one ways we have to think about that people bring to the table is that, do they have relevant insights to the markets you're interested in, to people groups you're serving, to folks that you're creating solutions for? If you don't have that type of insight, then you're going to find yourself put at a very big disadvantage as an organization, as a company. So we have to, value that difference. We have to consciously expand our networks, and this is for everybody, not just for people of the global minority. We have to consciously expand our networks and think about strategic sourcing as well, to try to combat and balance homogenous network hires. So it takes effort, it takes work, but it's absolutely something that we're going to have to do. And then think about the different types of equity we have to build in as well.
All right. Thanks, Laura. I read something this morning or maybe yesterday on LinkedIn. You know how people talk about diversity hire, like it's a negative thing, like, oh, are you the diversity hire? And this person said something about they wanted to coin the term homogeneity hire. So we can say, oh, you're the diversity hire, you're the homogeneity hire, because you're hired because you're exactly the same, not necessarily because you're more skilled. And I thought that was just funny as a way to look at it, because oftentimes when we talk about, diversity recruitment, it often is perceived as though you need to give up skills for that diversity, which is of course BS. But okay, so I have a last question here for Nicole, and then we have to move on to the questions from the audience. So Nicole, your experience as an immigrant in Iceland, and also in a leadership position, how do you think, because how long have you been in Iceland, Nicole?
Over 20 years now.
Over 20 years.
And it's been a climb. It's been a climb. I moved here cleaning floors. I have literally and did the immigrant experience with, as it's called, re-educating myself, working 4 jobs, trying to take language skills, working my way up. So yeah.
How would you say that the representation has improved over the past 20 years in leadership roles for immigrants?
I'm going to be brutally honest and very personal at this time. Unfortunately, leadership roles and representation of immigrants in Iceland are few and far between, and the sector where I see the biggest move forward is where immigrants themselves have taken initiative and started their own companies and or work together. For example, I mentioned I'm currently the only director of a government agency. The government agency is being put to rest at the end of this month and moved under the Directorate of Labor. And I will not be moving in a leadership role into the new agency. So I'm faced with the climb again. And I literally have to put in my cover letters, you have an opportunity to hire a leader of foreign origin with experience. All of the things that I write above it about my experience, there's something that I have to remind people of the opportunity, not just to have my experience and knowledge in their company or agency or whatever it is, the opportunity that's presented in having that diversity, because as you mentioned, a lot of times it's used sort of against. Just huge news with the bank in San Jose, Silicon Valley. What did the right-wing governor in Florida say? Laura, you heard it. It's because of diversity that the bank failed. But that's, beside. So here in Iceland, leadership and representation of immigrants in leadership roles is not very visible. And it's even less visible when you get down to, public sectors, which are huge hiring entities, which would be at the municipality level, where service provision is, where our immigrants are. They're not going to their Department of Welfare and seeing the head of the department being someone they understand, someone who, as I say, speaks and writes with an accent. It matters, it really does. And when we talk about policy, I agree with what you were saying earlier about policy. Too many policy initiatives are checks. They're just checklists. Okay, we've got the translation things, we've got this, we've got that. And the reason is because of that lack of leadership. that lack of knowledge, that lack of experience, that lack of being the immigrant who's, you know, tried on the shoes as a cleaner, tried on the shoes of, you know, working into the system, experienced discrimination, had to, as I think it's MI says here on the side, you know, saying the story of discrimination again and again and again, but not seeing actions, and actually being put into a position where you can create policy that is a guideline, creates understanding, funding, and initiatives that will be lasting. And a good example of that is just yesterday I rolled out settlement initiatives, I guess you could call it a policy, where I actually worked with a community who has gone from like 8% immigrant population a few years back to over 50% today. And they're enacting those initiatives, and we could speak together from a position of experience. Me as a leader with people listening, and them as not only followers, but, you know, preachers of practice. So that's, so policy and practice, they have to be built, and leadership of a diverse nature matters.
Right.
And it's not enough of it, sorry.
Right. Thanks, Nicole. So to round up, I'm going to ask each person to take less than 1 minute in answering this question. I know it's hard, but please try so we can get to the question. What is your top tip? So just one tip on how to center and amplify equity within Nordic diversity and inclusion discourse or ambition. I'm going to start with Mamta.
2 tips, but in less than 1 minute, listen to the underrepresented groups and understand what they need, and ensure there are key stakeholders in decision-making, key stakeholders that will help you drive the decisions. So listen, drive in key areas.
Thanks, Mamta. Nicole.
Simple, define it, invest in it, and implement it. My 30 seconds, that's it. It'll work if you do those 3 things.
Thanks, Nicole. Carolina?
So I was also on the writing a few words, and I would say, first of all, join the agenda, because we are stronger when we are together. Be vocal about it. And when I say be vocal, not only in this safe environment, which is, you know, this space we have here, but use your LinkedIn, use the voice you have to bring the agenda. And just to conclude, I'll give an example of, you know, when the foreigners are seen as a workforce, when the war blew in Ukraine, I saw so many of the Danish news talking about how they're going to bring those refugees and joining and showing all the cleaning jobs that were available for them. We need to stop that. So, for example, back then I used my LinkedIn to be a big voice about stop it, talk about it. If you know someone who is looking for a job, it's not only nothing wrong about a cleaning job, but there's so many people coming with skills that we can use in this industry. So that's what I mean about join the agenda and be vocal. When you see something concrete that you see a problem, be vocal about it.
Right. Thank you. Laura?
Oof, okay. I'm going to say things maybe that are a little bit different from what you all said. Not that I disagree with them. I think they're all fantastic, but I'm going to add in a couple extra thoughts here. Connect it. Make certain that you are integrating what you're saying to the stakeholders. Make certain they understand the value proposition of equitability. That is not something for them, like the other groups. It's not an us and them thing. If you're really talking about, like, you know, building out a better society, it has to be something that people understand that this is actually our problem, not their problem, but our problem. And caring is a massive thing. We have to humanize some of the discussions, but making certain that when we're actually applying these things, when we're actually doing the actions, because absolutely we need to like define and do the actions, of course, clearly, but make certain that in the application of it, that we are going to support people, and that care is catered to people that we're actually supporting. We're going to make it systematic and not just episodic empathy, making certain that we're not just like doing things that are like ad hoc actions and such when it comes to looking at equitability, like one little tick box thing, make it systematic. And that we have accountability as well, that we're setting goals, we're following progress, and that we make sure it's measurable, that we can make certain that we're actually keeping this up to make it systematic and not just something that we're doing here and there.
Right. Thank you. Thank you all. I'm going to jump right into the question. We have the first question here from P. What are your thoughts on openly calling out companies using biased research data, like the list of the happiest country in the world, to boast about how inclusive said country is, even though this is far from the true picture? Do you think that this harms your chances of employment in the future? So I'm guessing the question here is, how harmful is, you know, a lot of Nordic countries being some of the happiest countries in the world in actually creating the real picture, I guess the reality of people who have challenges in the Nordics? I'm guessing this is what the question is about, and it's addressed to just anyone. So maybe you want, yeah, okay, Nicole.
And, just if we look at migration, we look and we see, in all honesty, I think we need to speak honestly about what's happening with migration. This goes out and it says this is the happiest place to be. There are lots of jobs, and what do we see? We see people who come here with great expectations. We see, I mean, we're starting to see more and more infringements to be like on the job market. We're going to start seeing a lot more human trafficking, because I think you'll see that in happy countries, we let things slide too. We don't necessarily, you know, we're happy, we're doing things right, we have equality. That can't be happening here. So we have to be really careful about these indexes and taking for what they are. It's even I mentioned the MEPEX index earlier. It's based on policy. It's based on things that are set forward, and it's not necessarily based on what's actually happening. So there has to be sort of, as Laura came in on earlier, there has to be a balance between what's actually happening here and what's being said here. So while there are many occasions to be very happy living in the Nordics, we realize that the reality isn't happiness for everyone all the time. And we have to be careful.
Right. Laura?
Okay, I have a lot of feelings on this one. I want to basically make sure this person realizes, firstly, what they're saying is the truth. Absolutely, what they're saying is the truth. There is a discrepancy between, you know, the image that gets put out there and some of the realities people experience. But I want you to also realize that communication is a tool. And I want you to think about your communication as having a goal and impact. Everything you say is going to have a goal and impact, or should have a goal to it. And you want to target towards the impact you're going for. Calling companies out is something that is a great cathartic goal. It makes you feel better. That's great. Calling people in, calling companies in, targeting your communication for strategic change, inviting some things for actions that are going to make it different. That is going to be far more impactful than just saying, hey, you did bad. Okay, let's think about, hey, can we do these things to do better? That's a bit more actionable, and that's going to take you a bit further. When you're talking about getting blacklisted, or like if people are going to, like, you know, this is going to stop you from, you know, getting a job in the future, usually the difference between, you know, whether that's the case is going to be, are you calling out or calling in? Have you just pointed out the negative things, or are you thinking about, you know, some ways of being able to try to make it better? What are some things, some actionable steps and things that we can do? If you can make it productive communication, that's going to get you a lot further than just saying the things that will make you feel better. And the truth telling, absolutely tell the truth, but make certain you tell the truth in a way that's going to have an actual impact to making things a better place for other people as well.
Right. Thanks, Laura. The next question here is from Mark Ivan, and they say, as a Black Dane, my experience is that the majority loves storytelling and hearing stories of discrimination, and write articles and talk about it as a sad problem, but nothing happens in terms of change and action. For 30+ years, we've been sharing stories about discrimination and focused on awareness. What are your thoughts on how we can move beyond trauma porn and putting label on the marginalized to use personal stories and anecdotes in the name of creating change? How do we shift this more to the empowered and all allies to push for action? A small note, being native/fluent in Nordic culture and language does not protect against systems of oppression, though it is a privilege. Completed integration is also a Nordic myth. So this is a big one. And I guess Mark Ivan says they would like Carolina to answer this, and also want to hear from anyone else who has an input. We have 5 minutes, so Carolina, if you can do this quickly, and then we see if somebody else has something to add to it.
That's a tough one, and I wished I had all the answers, here to come with a very straightforward way of a solution. But the truth is, it's difficult. You use yourself so many examples of why is it so difficult. But from my perspective, what I do in order to go away of only sharing the story, again, I think sharing stories make people visualize and in a way understand better there's a problem. And I'm talking about that, for example, when I talk about the women leadership community and why we share stories about, for instance, you're in an auditorium, in a tech conference, stand up, look around. You're the only man. Well, sorry, you're the way majority across the auditorium where we are very few. So those are examples that I often talk about when I share these stories. But if you're asking about a concrete aspect, and I mentioned one before, Chisom, when you asked for the 1 minute, and I tried to be very fast, but I will repeat it. For example, when the war came in Ukraine, I was devastated by the whole situation, as of course all of us are, but I was also angry at it when I saw all the reaction of the Danish media, for example. Over and over on TV, you would see them portraying the idea of those, the refugees are coming here, we are offering, we're embracing them, we are saying welcome, we are offering their jobs, and then they would only show jobs which were very related to cleaning or etc. So I myself took the action to say, I don't agree with this. What can I do from my position? I started to see some people popping on LinkedIn looking for jobs, coming from Ukraine. So I took an action of how can I help them? Start activating my network, share the profile across my network, share the profile with recruiting agencies in my company and say, do we have a position? So I'm so sorry to say, Mark, I don't have a concrete answer. I have the feeling that we do also within what we can to help. And for example, this was what I did when I saw the whole situation in Ukraine. How can I help those people to come here and actually not be put into this square limitation of what they can offer? But I'm still in a very privileged aspect of being a white immigrant, right? So go for it, Laura. I think you want to say something.
Yeah, one quick thing. I think a lot of it can go down to that narrative of white saviorism, to be honest. The whole idea of you need to see people suffering that you can save. And people don't realize that in deconstructing toxic systems and deconstructing systems that are not going to be equitable, they're actually saving themselves. Okay.
Indeed.
You're saving, and that's what I'm saying. We have to break down this whole us and them when it comes to equitability work. And people have to absolutely understand that, in tearing down systems that are constructed to create inequality, you're tearing down certain kinds of, things that maybe one might have benefited from if you were from certain kind of minority groups, global minority groups. But the reality is, ultimately, our fates are interconnected at this point in time. And if we are, shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of certain people that we're not letting in, certain people that we're not empowering, that's going to be shooting ourselves in the foot. We can't stride forward, together when we do that to ourselves. So I think that's a thing when we try to build a better system, that's a more equitable system, more equitable structure. We have to make certain that it's not just focusing on, I need to save you. No, people are not that, altruistic as a whole. They have to kind of think of it as more like, I need to save ourselves. We need to save ourselves in that sense,
I feel like this is such a big question that we could unpack it.
Indeed. That's why I'm also holding, it's a long.
Nicole, did you want to say
I
something?
just wanted to piggyback on Laura, and she actually threw in the word that I was waiting for to fall out of her mouth: empower. We don't save anybody. If we want a society where equity is a real value, both sides of the fence, what we do to create it and the fact that people can define it, then we have to look at our roles as maybe people at the forefront or people who, you know, have these ideas of creating the pathway for that to exist. And that means working with people who are looking for equity and those who have to provide it and make sure that it exists. So it's, I was thinking so many times when anyone has been speaking today, my hands keep going together. When I re-educated myself, I did it as a teacher, and I think of the woven curriculum of the Te Wahiki early childhood curriculum in New Zealand, because it talks about weaving a fabric where all entities and cultures are interconnected. Each has their own value, their own color, their own use, but they're interwoven. And that's where equity works. And that's where this, you know, saving versus empowering, creating pathways, knocking down hindrances, that's how that is.
And just to add quickly, just in rounding up, I think it's also worth thinking about Mark Ivan's question from the perspective of people who are minoritized or racialized who come from said countries, and how challenges that they face are amplified or not. Because I think there's also a lot to unpack there in terms of, you know, we've been, as they said, they've been talking about this problem for 30 plus years and we're still talking about the problems. Right. And of course, it's easy to center our attention on, as we should, you know, with the Ukrainian wars and you know, how a lot of Nordic countries had to receive them, you know, looking at the resources they had access to, whether or not it was at the level it needed to be, and also looking at what access to the people who actually live in the country on the ground, who've been there for longer, who may not necessarily fit this A2, you know, piece of paper. What access do they have? How equitable is society for them, even when they speak the language, even when they identify as Danes, as Nordmen or Icelanders, for example. So I think that's also something we should reflect on in terms of like equity. So with this, I do want to say thank you to each one of you. This has been a really, really interesting conversation. I think it could go on for a lot longer. Made a lot of notes, really good insights. So thank you, Mamta, Nicole, Carolina, and Laura. I really appreciate your time. And for everyone who's joined us on Zoom and also on LinkedIn, thank you for your time and your attention. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you at the next Blaze panel discussion, I think in May.